So this is where I get to say, is this thing on? Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Herper. I'm the editorial director of events at STAT, and I'm here to welcome you. I actually don't have remarks. That's what comes next. Just here to say hello and try to get everybody to sit down. So, great. It looks like people are filtering in. It's really great to see all of you. For those of you who don't know, we do a good number of events here at STAT. We have these DC events fairly regularly, several times a year. And if any of you are willing to travel, we'll have an event at JP Morgan, and we'll have our summits, which are full-day events, in March in New York, and in May in San Francisco. So would love to see any of you there. Anyway, I would just like to welcome to the stage Rick Burke, STAT's co-founder and executive editor.
Thank you, Matt. I just want to thank all of you for coming, especially on such a blustery, freezing day. This is like, I came from Boston today, but it's like, this is like Boston. Like you want to escape, you want to escape this. But anyway, thank you for making the extra effort to come. And I also want to thank you all for being such loyal STAT readers, because almost everyone here tonight is a STAT Plus subscriber or reader, and that's, really, we're 8 years. Our 8th birthday was in last month, and we're really founded on our loyal, subscribing, paying readers who want to pay for high-quality journalism, and I really appreciate your support. And I also just want to say that if you don't know, there are all kinds of things you can benefit from if you're a subscriber. We just launched something which I don't think any other media company does that I've heard of, called Stat Plus Connect. And it's a way for STAT readers to connect with each other and with STAT reporters. And we have all kinds of live chats and events and job boards and all kinds of things. And it's just getting off the ground, but we already have well over 1,000 people connecting, and that's just the beginning. And I just highly recommend you just sort of look into it on our site. And as Matt said, we have these event summits in San Francisco, New York. We have events around the country, Boston. And I want to just encourage you all to check out our other events and check out as well we have, and you probably read most of them, but we have like 10 newsletters, and I, particularly since we're here in DC, want to hawk our amazing twice-a-week DC Diagnosis newsletter. We have our Health Care Inc. weekly newsletter that's new, but really gaining ground fast. We have the famous Ed Silverman's Pharma Lot, Pharma Little. We have our Readout Biotech morning newsletters. And there are many more that I'm forgetting, but I just want to encourage you to take a look if you don't already. And I just also want to just say that I hope you have time before the evening is over to talk to some of our DC reporters and editors who are here. DC has always been a really important foundation for STAT. I spent most of my career in DC, so when we started STAT, this was like one of the first things we did was establish a DC bureau. And right now we even have more people in DC than our sister publication, the Boston Globe. We're really committed to DC. And if you just look at our site today, we have a couple FDA stories. We have stories about Biden drug strategies. We have all kinds of stories that are of interest to this audience. Now I want to just step aside and sort of hope you'll enjoy the evening. We have a great lineup, and I want to also thank Frank Harvey, who's and from SureScript, which is sponsoring tonight's event. I want to welcome him to the stage and thank you for sponsoring, and thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Rick. I really appreciate it. I'll be brief so we can get to Scott and the other panelists. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. And if you're like me, you probably spent part of last week with family, friends, loved ones, spending time really reconnecting. And I hope that love that you have for them is part of what brought you here tonight. Because after all, at some point, either yourself, your loved ones, they're all going to be patients. And being a patient in our current healthcare system is not necessarily a great thing. But there are a lot of things working together we can help solve. So let me step back and tell you just a little bit about SureScripts if you're not familiar. Most people know SureScripts as establishing the nationwide electronic prescribing network. But we're much more than that. As a matter of fact, we're the largest healthcare interoperability company. Over 22 billion transactions of movement of clinical data a year. 22 billion. So that means any day there are millions and millions of healthcare information being moved on our network. The movement of, it's not just e-prescribing. When you go to your doctor and they check your benefit, that generally comes across our network. When you go to your doctor and they see what the price of your drug is, what's covered, where it's least expensive for you, that goes across our network. And it really helps inform the patients so they're not shocked when they get to the pharmacy about the price of their medications. It also provides therapeutic alternatives for the doctors to make other decisions, whether maybe it's the right therapy, but it's the wrong price for a patient. So all of those things sort of run across our network. If you're a patient and you go to a hospital or a health system, it's really important that the doctors, before they start treating you, know what medications you're on. That all goes across our network. As a matter of fact, 99% of the U.S. population is transacted across the SureScripts network. Virtually every physician, every pharmacy, every health system, every electronic health record vendor transacts with SureScripts. So we're really ubiquitous across healthcare. There was an article in Forbes this morning, some of you may have seen, talking about Epic. And many of you probably know the Epic and the amazing things that they've done for health systems. One of the quotes in there was that SureScripts, with the work we've done, they estimate have saved the U.S. healthcare system about $140 billion since we were founded. We're a very optimistic company, but we're also very clear-eyed about the issues that we have facing us. Drug shortages, provider burnout, pharmacist burnout, spiraling cost of healthcare. But our hope is that you leave here today more energized about how working together with the right vision and the right leadership, we can help solve some of these issues and continue to each year to solve more and more of those. So again, I look forward, I'll spend a little time with you in a few minutes, but I want to turn it back over, I guess, to Matt, who's going to do a great interview I've really been looking forward to. Matt?
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome to the stage, and I'm hoping, do we have a mic here for Scott? All right. That's kind of important. You want to hear him more than me, right? So please welcome to the stage Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Hi, Scott.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So Scott Gottlieb's been one of the most lucid thinkers, conservative thinkers in healthcare for almost 2 decades. He held various roles at the FDA and CMS before serving as the Deputy Commissioner of Medicals and Scientific Affairs at the FDA from 2005 to 2007. Following that, he was a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a venture partner at NEA. From May 2017 till April 2019, he served as Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. From 2017 till April 2019, he served, I just repeated that. But anyway, he's retaken those perches at AAI and NEA, and he also serves on the boards of Pfizer, Illumina, Aetion, and Tempus. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thank you.
So I just stumbled over a whole bunch of acronyms, and I have a bunch more I want to ask about you. I want to ask you about, including the IRA and the CDC, but I want to start with something a bit broader, which is the GOP. Scott, you've
The
been...
GOP or the GLP?
The GOP. How many members of the GOP need the GLP, Scott?
Is that the question?
No. Well, you can answer it if you want. But really what I wanted to ask, we were talking about beforehand, do you think there is a motivating conservative philosophy about healthcare right now? What does the Republican Party stand for in terms of healthcare?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it would be easy to articulate what the conservative philosophy for healthcare reform is right now. I think for a long time there was conservative philosophy around trying to create more competition within government programs like Medicare. You saw conservatives, backing initiatives to try to expand Medicare Advantage, trying to expand competition within the Part D drug benefit. That comprised the conservative agenda on healthcare for the early part of the 2000s. I think obviously with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, a lot of you can argue whether this really constituted a philosophy around healthcare reform, but a lot of the conservative ideology around healthcare focused on repeal and replace and strategies to try to get in place different structures to take the place of the Affordable Care Act. You saw a lot of support for things like health savings accounts and trying to put consumers more in charge of the distribution of their healthcare dollars. I think right now, if you sort of zoom out, it'd be hard to articulate what the conservative agenda is on healthcare. You don't hear conservatives talking as much about trying to expand, do things to support competition within the Medicare program through vehicles like Medicare Advantage plans. As you know, the marketplace is troubled right now. A lot of provider systems are pulling out of Medicare Advantage. You're seeing companies that provide the plans getting out of the marketplace as well. And you don't see conservatives necessarily talking about ways to reform that market to make it more robust and competitive. There really isn't a strategy for how you would replace the Affordable Care Act. I think most people now accept the Affordable Care Act as a structure that's going to persist in perpetuity, and if we're going to reform it, it's going to be more incremental reforms. I don't see a conservative philosophy around trying to create more competition within drug markets. We talked a lot about that when I was at FDA, trying to reduce gaming within the generic drug marketplace to facilitate more access to generic drugs. We talked about trying to make Part B a competitively bid system. Now you see conservatives supporting price controls, not really a conservative philosophy. So it would be hard for me to step back and articulate to you or anyone what the conservative philosophy is generally on healthcare reform. One of the things that I've been talking about a little bit and probably going to talk more about is trying to look at a lot of the ways that we establish payment mechanisms within government programs, particularly Medicare, which ends up influencing the entire market, which I think ends up distorting the flow of resources within healthcare, because the way things are reimbursed, you see provider systems, you see product developers over-investing in certain places rather than others because of the way things are reimbursed, not necessarily because of what's optimized from a public health standpoint. So I think looking at things like DRGs and the other kinds of payment mechanisms would constitute conservative reform, but
it's a real problem when the solutions are that technical, right? In the current political environment.
I think the kinds of things those kinds of things are incremental, and they don't really constitute the kind of conceptual reforms of the market that I think you can get popular support around. So there are things conservatives, I think, if they were in power, if you had a Republican head of CMS, I think there's things you can do to try to bring more competition into healthcare markets, but it's all those kinds of incremental, technocratic reforms and not something that is a sort of sweeping conservative vision for how to create more competition and empower consumers. I think part of the reason why there isn't really a conservative philosophy is because a lot of consumers rejected those ideas, and so it was hard to campaign on them, or it would be hard to campaign on them now.
I mean, what does seem to have a lot of force is, and as a Pfizer board member and someone who wrote a book about the pandemic, it's probably troubling to you, but I don't want to assume, but the anti-vax stuff, the kind of not liking anything about the system and distrusting it, I mean, that seems like a major thread. Does it bother you? Does it?
Well, look, there's been a backlash to public health more generally, globally, and certainly within the United States. I think it's more manifest in the political right, for sure. And at the time, it's hard to pick sort of a moment in time in the pandemic or one policy that drove a lot of this. But I think if I was to sort of go back in time, I think one was just a lot of the mitigation that we implemented. I used to say we have on-ramps, but we didn't have explicit off-ramps. So we left things in place too long, mandates, restrictions on gatherings, mask ordinances. there was a place for all of that, but we left those measures in place too long, and I think there was a backlash to that. But I think the bigger inflection point, in my view, was the vaccine mandate. And at the time, I was calling it a bridge too far, and particularly the one that we tried to implement as a condition of work under the OSHA regulations. I felt that was a bridge too far, and that whatever we were going to achieve in terms of getting vaccination rates up and the public health impact of that, the backlash to vaccine requirements more generally would offset any public health gain that we would achieve. And I think that to some extent has been borne out. I think you now are seeing a backlash to mandates that we've long taken for granted, like childhood immunization schedules. You've seen vaccination rates fall for things like MMR. And I worry this is going to be generational, that this isn't just sort of a secular political trend that's going to last an election cycle, but this is more of a generational shift around people's embrace of vaccines. And things like, you're seeing things from the political right that I wouldn't have expected. There was something on Twitter today they sent around to some people from a conservative institution, sort of very negative portrayal of the drug industry. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans and conservatives were proponents of innovation-based companies and industries like the biotech industry, and now you're seeing a lot of criticism. Things like embrace of nutraceuticals and things like kratom coming from the political right. I'm old enough to remember when it was conservatives who were trying to ban fentanyl analogs and put Sudafed behind the counter as ways to try to address the drug crisis, whether those policies were right or wrong. Now they're embracing nutraceuticals that could be used as opioid analogs. And so there's been a real shift in ideology and among, I think, conservatives more generally. So it gets to your original question about what is the conservative philosophy on healthcare, but there also has been kind of changed roles politically, if you will.
Do you have any other lessons from the pandemic that if you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing we're doing, what are we doing wrong now that we should have learned?
The one thing I think the two things in the pandemic, I mean, one I've touched on, which was I think the vaccine mandates at a time when it was hard to understand where things were heading, but clearly there was a point in time when the virus was mutating, the vaccines were losing effectiveness. We already had about 80% of the population, a little bit more than that, vaccinated at the time that we implemented those work requirement mandates. And there wasn't a really good public health argument that if you implemented the OSHA requirements and you got the vaccination rates up to 85% or 86%, that there was sort of a magic threshold that was suddenly going to really break off chains of transmission. So there wasn't really a sound public health rationale for what did we want to achieve with it. There was just sort of a sense that if we can get more people vaccinated, it was going to be better. So I think that was a critical point, that if you had a magic wand, I think people would do things differently. Even the people who were proponents of that, I think would think differently about it with hindsight. And hindsight's obviously, it's easy to say now. The other thing was just at the outset, not having diagnostic tests in place early. That's something that would have been fixable. If you would have called Thermo Fisher, Mark Casper, the CEO of Thermo Fisher, or Agile, any of the companies, and said, look, we need you to crash a line right now, back in January.
That was an organizational problem. They were not brought in soon enough.
It was, I don't know. I mean, was it organizational, was it political, that they didn't want to create, sort of the perception of fear around the virus at a time when some people thought that it wasn't going to impact the U.S. and certainly the globe. If you started to spin up production lines, that would have sent a very clear message that you were worried about it. So I don't know what drove it. Or it just might have been, to your point, organizational and, nobody was really taking charge early on. But if we had had a diagnostic test that we could mass distribute early, and this would have cost Thermo $5 million to crash a line, to convert an existing line to do it, we would have been able to not just know where the virus was early, but know where it wasn't. And at the point in which we had to implement the mitigation to try to control spread rather than do it nationally, we could have focused it on communities and states where we knew the virus was already spreading. Because once you implemented the mitigation measures nationally, first of all, we asked a lot of places in the country to shut down that probably didn't need to, because there was no virus spreading in certain regions of the country. We now know that this was highly regionalized. But you lost support for those measures because people knew that they were being asked to implement provisions that at that point in time they didn't need to be taking. So you could have targeted the mitigation on a city-by-city basis as you had evidence that there was spread in certain regions. And I think you would have maintained support for a lot of the measures that we ultimately need to reach for longer.
So, two things I've gleaned from this conversation so far is that you're not sure about the current direction of healthcare thinking and conservatism, and that you don't really like watching other people do the job. So, I'm wondering, would you serve again as an FDA commissioner in a Republican administration, which right now looks like it would likely be a Trump administration, but who knows, elections?
Yeah, look, I've been asked this question, different iterations of this question at different points in time
every
of my
time,
career,
right?
And I don't like to be the person to say I would never do it. I mean, I think the circumstances, the setup would need to be right that you could feel like you can accomplish something meaningful in those jobs. But it's hard to say what I would or wouldn't do in the future, depending on what the setup was.
Okay, I want to move on to other acronyms now. So let's do the Inflation Reduction Act, not the other IRA, but the one in our remit here. Do you think the IRA is going to have? We've been hearing all sorts of speculation on both sides about how the law will affect industry and patients. Let me ask those separately. Is it going to have much of an impact on industry? What are your current thoughts?
Well, it already
as
is
a
having an
board
impact
member?
on industry, but it's hard to convince people of.
Is it going to hurt drug company earnings?
I think it won't hurt drug company earnings as much as people might have projected, and that's why I think you haven't seen the markets really react to the IRA. Because what drug companies are going to do is they're going to invent around the IRA, and that's what I worry about. And I talked at the outset about trying to look at things like the DRGs and the prospective payment systems, Medicare, and all the ways that they're distorting investment decisions. Every hospital is building out a cardiology department because that's where they make money, or a GI department, not necessarily because they need those resources, but because that's what's still profitable under Medicare reimbursement. So you get more services in those areas, and healthcare is one of the few places where supply creates demand. So you build out a cardiology department, suddenly you do more interventional cardiology. I think the same thing's going to happen here, and you're already seeing it, particularly on the venture capital side, and I'm seeing it, and you're probably seeing some of it too, where people are making investment decisions away from markets where they think they're going to be heavily penalized under the IRA. And so you're now getting distortions in investment decisions that might or might not comport with what public health goals should be, but certainly nobody designed the IRA to try to drive investment into certain areas and not others. Nobody, when they designed the IRA, said, you know what, we don't want any small molecules developed for Alzheimer's anymore. There's too much investment in small molecules for Alzheimer's.
Companies that say they're not developing small molecules, or developing less, you still see Lilly coming out with a GLP-1. You see Flagship investing in small molecule companies.
It's very hard. So certainly for the big companies, you can't just change your R&D overnight. If you have a big combinatorial chemistry program and you have a small molecule program, going after certain targets, you're invested in that space. You might slowly start to pull investment away from that space, but you're not going to pivot overnight. Where you're going to see the pivot overnight is in venture investment, because it's much more fluid, where programs are coming before venture investors, and now you bake in the IRA, and certain programs just aren't going to get over the hurdle rate. And I've seen programs that didn't get over the hurdle rate because now you're baking in that you're not going to have 12 years of exclusivity, you're going to have 9 on a small molecule, and suddenly the return can't justify the investment. And that's unfortunate. It's difficult to make those decisions, but you're in a world where you have competing priorities.
But did you think that, won't this make drugs somewhat more accessible, somewhat cheaper for patients?
No, that was the second part of your question. Is it good for patients? There's no question that the buy down under the IRA of the out-of-pocket costs for senior citizens is going to help a whole bunch of people. It's going to make drugs more accessible, help people stay on drugs that they should be on, and they're not going to be as pressed with the out-of-pocket costs and come off drugs because they can't afford the co-pays. So it's definitely going to help consumers, but that's a small fraction of the savings achieved by the IRA. Most of the money that the IRA is taking out of the industry, taking out of the sector, went for subsidizing other things like the green energy subsidies. And so you could have bought down the out-of-pocket costs and capped the catastrophic spending for just a small fraction of the overall magnitude of the resources that are being taken out of the drug sector by the IRA. But it won't. I think to your fundamental question, will it take down pharmaceutical industry earnings? I think it's going to have a near-term impact because there's certain drugs that are just impacted by it over the next 3, 4, 5 years. But over the long run, I think you're going to see shifts of capital. And the last point I'll make is that I am of the belief that a big reason why you saw so much investment flow into drugs that was sort of first-in-class targeting medical needs was the structure of the Medicare Modernization Act and Part D benefit, where we created that specialty tier. This was Mark McClellan's idea, that you would create competition where there were sort of good enough generics, but if you had a truly innovative drug, it would be put on the specialty tier where it was reinsured and there wouldn't be a lot of competition. And investors saw that and they said, this is where we're going to be able to get pricing, so they shifted capital into drugs targeting, cancer, rare diseases, things like that, because that's where the pricing was going to be preserved. And so government policy can influence capital flows, both good and bad.
Do we have a question up there?
Hello, Sarah Diorsi with Fresenius Kavi. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this playing out for generics and biosimilars, and will they be impacted by this?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in the past. I do think that there's the law was designed in ways to try to avoid creating disincentives to invest in biosimilars or places where we have drug shortages like the sterile injectable drugs. But I think inevitably the IRA is going to reduce incentives to make those investments. You look at the inflation caps. I mean, I'm on the board of Pfizer. Pfizer manufactures penicillin G. And that was one of the drugs. And if you go online right now and you look up penicillin G, I think 4 milliliters, 1.2 million units, which is what's used to treat syphilis, I think costs, it says about $500. Obviously, that's the list price. There's discounting in the marketplace. So not an exorbitantly expensive drug. I mean, there must be like $200 of QC in there because it's a sterile injectable drug. That was one of the drugs. I think Pfizer took maybe a 15% price increase. I forget exactly. And it was one of the drugs subjected to the inflation caps. And the money was going to be used to reinvest in manufacturing. They have reinvested more money in manufacturing of that drug. Shortly after that policy was put in place and the company was subject to the inflation caps, there was an article, I think you guys might have ran it, or it might have been the New York Times, that the White House was considering declaring a public health emergency because there was a shortage of penicillin G and rising rates of syphilis. So you have one portion of the government saying this is a public health crisis, we don't have enough penicillin G, and the IRA giving another arm of the government the ability to impose inflation caps and cut a $50 price increase to a $30 price increase that would have been used to reinvest in manufacturing. So
let's put a pin in that. I think that'll be interesting to ask some of our other speakers about later. We've actually covered it. Is there another question out there? Oh, well, let's do that with the remaining time.
Hi, I'm Maisha from Inside Washington Publishers. So I was wondering, do you think that the IRA has eased tensions between CMS and FDA a bit and has forced a closer collaboration that is, spilling into areas like biosimilars and accelerated approvals and drug shortages? So, if so, could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about that question. I'm not sure how the IRA would be. First of all, I wouldn't necessarily characterize the relationship between FDA and CMS as one of tension.
Aduhelm?
Well, Aduhelm, yes. I mean, there have been flashpoints, I think, and points of disagreement between the two agencies historically. I will say, when Seymour was there, we tried to coordinate quite a bit, and you saw that around the CAR T
Yeah, you
approval,
guys
for
got
example.
along, but lately.
But I think that coordination needs to be at a leadership level, and then that gets driven down into the organization. And I think that certainly didn't happen around Aduhelm, and I don't blame FDA for that. I think CMS was out over its skis on that decision. But I don't see anything in the IRA that would necessarily align the two agencies more closely together. I mean, the reality is, from my view at least, CMS is in the business of making determinations around interchangeability, and the IRA is going to drive them further in this direction, that just are antithetical to the FDA. I mean, look at what CMS is about to do with respect to how they're going to do pricing under the IRA. They're probably going to say that, you know, Xarelto is interchangeable with warfarin, or something to that extent, right? They're going to be using generic drugs to compare to branded drugs for purposes of trying to find benchmarks for pricing, where they're going to say two drugs are equivalent or equivalent enough to price them similarly. Whereas FDA would look at that and they would say, no way. From a clinical standpoint, one drug is clearly differentiated than the other drug. So I think if anything, you're going to have CMS making determinations that would never get into drug labeling, wouldn't even be considered by FDA to be incorporated into drug labeling. I think it's going to put the two agencies further in conflict. This is another reason why I think the IRA is going to set up a lot of tension, because once they make those pronouncements, which they're going to do for purposes of trying to drive down pricing of some of these branded drugs, that's a federal agency making a sort of a medical determination that is going to conflict with medical clinical guidelines, clinical literature, certainly the FDA approvals and the FDA labeling, and that's going to put CMS in a very difficult position. And this is someplace where I think if you were looking at reforming the IRA, I think Congress should provide much more discipline and impose more guidelines on what CMS can and can't do with those determinations.
So we have a little more than a minute left. I want to give you one last chance to backseat FDA Commissioner. This morning, the FDA made an announcement about CAR T therapies potentially causing lymphoma, which was reacted to with shock by a lot of the big researchers in CAR T who haven't seen cases of this. How do you think, do you have any opinions on how the FDA should have, I know you're working on a book on cell therapy, so this is a topic you know well. Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have thoughts on how they should, look, I don't know what they're looking at, right? I'm working on a book, as you mentioned, on the history of the development of the CAR T therapies, and we approved Kymriah when I was at the agency, and then 2 subsequent CAR T therapies. There wasn't a lot of substance in the announcement. I think it would have been helpful if there was more detail in there, if they actually had evidence to sort of descriptively provide what they're looking at. I think it's going to be, if there is a sort of weak signal, and I suspect it's something that is at this point a weak signal, or else it would be more apparent to the clinicians in the community. I think it's going to be hard to tease apart what is treatment related, because a lot of the patients who get CAR T are heavily pretreated with radiation and chemotherapy, and what could be drug related. But you know, one of the things from just a policy standpoint, I'll only take a minute here, when it came to drug safety issues, what we said is when we have evidence that there may be a causal relationship between a drug side effect and a drug, we have to go out to the public with that early and inform them of what we're looking at and why we're looking at a particular question. Because as long as consumers understand that the agency is sort of on the job, they're not going to blame us. They're not going to feel that the agency somehow withheld something. And this philosophy grew out of the early 2000s with things like SSRIs and suicidality, where there was a perception that the FDA was sort of sitting on drug safety, Vioxx, that the FDA knew about drug safety problems but was sitting on them. And it wasn't that they were sitting on it, it was that they were unsure and they didn't want to go out with an announcement until they were sure, because they didn't know how consumers would react to sort of speculative information. So the philosophy changed from a risk communication standpoint in the agency, but what it requires is the agency to be much more descriptive when you talk about an early safety signal. What do you know? What do you don't know? What are you looking at? Why do you think you need to go out with the announcement and start collecting more information? Because a lot of the reasons why you go out with announcements like this is to instigate reporting and get clinicians more aware. I think what was lacking today, if there was anything lacking in that announcement, was just more detail. And it may be because they don't have it. It may be because they just have some very early signals and they put out what they knew.
All right. We're going to have to close out there. Thank you so much, Scott, for doing this. It was a lot of fun. So for our next sponsored discussion, please welcome back to the stage Frank Harvey, the Chief Executive Officer of SureScripts, and to moderate, Rick Burke, the co-founder and executive editor at STAT.
Double-fisted here.
Here we are again. So we heard about SureScripts on your at your opening. So let's put that aside for a second and talk about you and your history and your childhood in Lynchburg, Virginia, and how you got into this field in the first place.
I got glad to. Born about 3 hours south here in a little town called Lynchburg, Virginia. And I decided at 6 years old that I wanted to be a pharmacist. And the reason I did was at 6, I was finally old enough for my father to take me with him on Saturday mornings to the soda fountain, where he would go to have his Saturday morning breakfast with a lot of the community around Lynchburg. They would go to Brookville Drugstore, 2 pharmacists, Gerald Maxey and Glenn Hilwish there. And at that point, 50 odd years ago, the pharmacists were the primary care provider for the community. And so I would sit there, enjoy my Krispy Kreme jelly donut, which is still one of my favorites. And I would watch, gradually each person get up from the soda fountain. They'd go over and spend a little bit of time with Gerald or Glenn. And I also saw with my own parents, who both had multiple comorbidities, how important that local pharmacist was to their health care. And so in a small town like that, and today in many small towns across the country, the pharmacists really are the first line of primary care.
But are they still? I mean, it's not the same anymore, right?
Well, it's not the same anymore. However, the pharmacists of today are so much better prepared than I was as a pharmacist getting out. I had my undergraduate at Virginia Tech, went to Medical College, Virginia, had a BS degree. I learned to count to 100 by fives after about 3 years. But I rapidly learned that the pharmacists today are so much better prepared. Most come in already with a 4-year degree before they come into pharmacy school. Most go to a residency after they earn their doctorate. Every pharmacist graduating today is graduating with a doctorate. Their skill and their training is so much more than ours was back 50 years ago, when in the small towns, pharmacists were the primary care providers in a lot of means.
And how does this all fit in with what you're doing now?
Well, a lot of ways. I wanted to be a pharmacist from the age of 6 because I saw how much they helped my parents. And also both of them had a lake house, and I didn't have a lake house. I really wanted a lake house, and I figured if they could afford that.
Do you have a lake house now?
I don't have, but I would love one in Smith Mountain, which is close to Lynchburg. But, so throughout my career, it's been healthcare focused for the last 40 years. So it's started there in pharmacy, went to life sciences with Eli Lilly and Hoffman LaRoche, and a company called Liberty Medical, where I was CEO and partial owner of that. It was a diabetic treatment company. A company called Marixa, medication therapy management, and ran my own venture fund for a number of years before coming to SureScripts. SureScripts, we're a mission-driven company, focused on 3 things: to improve the quality of healthcare, to reduce the cost of healthcare, and you heard the statistic earlier that they believe SureScripts has taken $140 billion out of healthcare since and to improve patient safety. And so what we look at and where we partner, and again, we partner with what we call the SureScripts Network Alliance, which is literally every pharmacy, every PBM, every health system, all of the pieces of the healthcare puzzle we connect with in some way to try to make it safer and make it better.
You talked at the outset about burnout, and we're seeing all the protests now from pharmacists. What's going on, and what needs to change?
Well, I think we need to look back at, got louder. I think we need to look back at sort of what's the root cause of the burnout, not just with pharmacy, but with physicians, with nurses, with PAs. And there are 2 things really at play there. One, there's a silver tsunami. What it is, right now we've got 58 million people in the U.S. that are age 65 and over. By 2030, it's estimated to be 70 million people that'll be age 65 and over. Now, the critical thing about the age 65 is 80% of the people, once they hit 65, have one chronic condition. 60% of those patients have 2 chronic conditions. So as we see the population aging, the need for healthcare is getting more and more dramatic. Secondly, because of provider burnout, first, a lot of the physicians are actually aging into that group where they're retiring. 20% of physicians say they're actually going to retire within the next 2 years. 30% of nurses, or 40% of nurses, are saying they're going to retire in the next 2 years. So what we have is this, these healthcare deserts already in some rural areas. You've got patients that are driving an hour or 2 or 100 miles to see a physician at times. So there really needs to be an evolution of the healthcare team. We took a look at all 3,233 counties across the U.S. And in 50% of those counties, there's less than one primary care provider. And primary care provider are FPs, internists, NPs, PAs. There's less than one for every 1,500 patients. And for those of you that know healthcare, there's no way someone, a practitioner, can really handle 1,500 patients and do it effectively.
Where does technology can technology fill the gap in
Well,
some of these
it's
deserts?
really a three-legged stool. We need to have an evolution of the care team so where pharmacists can take over sort of that lower level of primary care, the things that they're trained to do. It's well within their licensure. But there are three things we need to do. It's not just the technology. SureScripts and a number of our partners are working and will have the technology solved to make sure that the pharmacists have the right clinical information they need to make the right decisions. But it's also legislatively, it's at a state level, state by state, where states allow licensure for medical professionals, and so what they allow the pharmacists to do state by state. And thirdly, it's the reimbursement structure, and this is how we get into today's burnout that you'd ask about. We have to have reimbursement structures in place. We have to make sure that if pharmacists are going to do the additional work, the additional immunizations, additional chronic care management, there's some pay structure in place. Right now, it's not very good. I can tell you that the payment that they're getting for filling a prescription is very low at this point. There's no payment made in the majority of cases for chronic care management, which we need to evolve to. And immunizations has sort of been a savior to some of the pharmacists out there because they have been able to engage. The burnout is coming from the fact that pharmacists are having to do that whole plethora of things without the reimbursement structures in place to allow them to bring on more help, to sort of more techs to do the filling side, they can do the checking, and then they can spend time with patients on that chronic care management, which is really what they want to do. So there'll be more, job satisfaction around that as well.
So just in the closing couple minutes, I just want to you to elaborate on that a little bit. A pharmacist today is spending, a typical pharmacist spending X amount of time with technical stuff and X amount of time with patients. How would you like that balance to change?
Oh, absolutely. I think the pharmacist should be out front spending 80% of their time working with patients around chronic care. Patients see their pharmacist on average 13 times a year. They see their family practice physician on average 4 times a year. And it's going to get less. It's estimated that by 2034, there'll be a shortage of 150,000 primary care providers. The only healthcare professional that has the training, the bandwidth, and the desire to step into that gap is the pharmacist. And I think we need to work together in collaborative care arrangements from physicians and pharmacists working together to really provide the best care. Because at the end of the day, it's about what's best for the patient. And the best way to do that is to see an evolution of the care team.
And in our final minute here, is there anything more you want people to know about SureScripts and what you all do, or address any misconceptions that might be out there?
Sure. Well, I think most people thought of us as sort of the nationwide e-prescribing company, and hopefully a little earlier you'll learn more about what we do. We're really about providing simple, trusted health information sharing, making sure the right information is at the right place at the right time in the healthcare system. So whether it's the pharmacist or the nurse practitioner or the PA or the physician, they can make the right decision because they're well informed. They know what the clinical information is saying. Great example of that is, some patients have 250, 300-page clinical records. You've got to be able to boil that down. Our technology will be able to boil that down to sort of that summary paragraph about what are they dealing with at the moment so they can, in a very short period of time, understand what's the best decision to be made for those patients.
Great. Well, thanks for the chat, and you're making me nostalgic for those early days at the soda fountain with the stools and the whatever.
I looked in the mirror a little earlier and I was like, wow, I think I'm my dad. When did I convert from being the little kid to being my dad? Was I was seeing my reflection in the windows.
Welcome to the world of aging, I guess. Thanks,
Thank
Frank.
you so
really
much, Rick. I
appreciate it.
Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm not going to save a walk up there and just announce from back here. Now we're going to hear from the White House. Please welcome to the stage Kristen Link-Young, Deputy Assistant to the President for Health and Veterans Affairs at the White House Domestic Policy Council, and to moderate Rachel Kors, Washington correspondent at Stat. Head up, guys.
All right, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. There's truly so much going on, so I just want to make sure we jump in. Yeah.
Great, it's great to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. So the Biden administration is in the middle of implementing the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug price negotiation program. It's unprecedented. You're right in the middle of things. Can you offer us some color on kind of what's going on now? Are you having meetings? Are you crunching numbers? I mean, kind of what's the status?
Absolutely. Presidents have been talking for years about giving Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices, and we are so excited to finally be the administration that has gotten this done and is bringing this critical benefit to life for seniors and for the American people. As I think this audience is probably aware, since the law passed a little over a year ago, Medicare has gone through a process of providing detailed guidance to industry and to stakeholders about how the negotiation process would work. And just a couple of months ago, we announced the first 10 drugs that are subject to negotiation under the program. All 10 of the manufacturers of those drugs signed agreements to come in and participate in the Medicare program. And so Medicare is now at the negotiating table with those companies. The companies have provided reams of data to CMS. CMS has engaged in listening sessions with patients from all over the country on the impact of the drugs and the impact of high prices for those drugs on those patients, and is really going through the process now of coming up with their initial offer for the prescription drug prices. One thing I want to highlight as you think about what this program means, drugs are selected for negotiation in Medicare after they have been on the market a really long time. So these are all drugs that have been on the market for many years and have entered the phase where in some sense they should have generic competition. And so we are talking about therapies that have existed for a long time, that have a lot of patients who are taking them. They're successful therapies that are bringing meaningful clinical benefits to folks, and CMS is absolutely committed to ensuring that those benefits continue. But they also have had a long lifespan in the Medicare program, and that's a key part of the way Medicare is approaching this process.
Excellent. So are you going to be ready by, I think, is it February 1st to make that offer?
We are absolutely on schedule. The Medicare team is hard at work and getting those offers ready. We at the White House are not directly involved in those processes, but the CMS team is really doing excellent work and is committed to meeting those deadlines and keeping this process on schedule for folks.
Right. So from your perspective, you're saying that these drugs that have been selected have been on the market a long time. They should have generic competition already. But as we heard earlier, there are some in industry who have some concerns about the way that some of the provisions of the law are structured. So I think Dr. Gottlieb mentioned concerns that inflationary rebates or limits on drug price hikes could exacerbate drug shortages that we're seeing now. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another critical provision of the Inflation Reduction Act is a requirement that if drug companies are increasing their prices faster than inflation, then in general, they're going to owe a rebate back to the Medicare program. This requirement does not apply to multi-source generic drugs, and it doesn't apply to drugs that have a relatively low spend. So it's really targeted to high-spend drugs or drugs that are single-source products. And so as a result, it excludes almost all the drugs that are likely to be in shortage or any place where we're seeing drug shortages. There are some exceptions. There are occasionally branded products that go into shortage or single source generic drugs that do go into shortage. And in those cases, the IRA provides CMS with a lot of flexibility to reduce or waive rebates under the IRA. CMS has made clear that they will be exercising that authority. Guidance on that topic is forthcoming from the agency, but I think there's a lot of flexibility built into the law to really address and ameliorate some of those difficulties. And in terms of other impacts on industry, I started to get into some of this, but just to highlight, if you look at the top drug that Medicare is negotiating, Eliquis, it's a drug that's been on the market for many years. And the manufacturer of that drug spent most of 2020 in court trying to fend off generic competition for that drug. There was a period where it seemed like we were headed towards a generic for that drug in the relatively near future. That didn't happen. The manufacturer prevailed in court, and so as a result, they've earned themselves the privilege of getting paid $16 billion by Medicare last year alone. And so the IRA is stepping in and giving Medicare the power to negotiate prices in that circumstance. And so, from my perspective, a lot of what the IRA is doing is making it a little bit less attractive at the margin for those manufacturers to spend years in court fighting off generic competition, to game the patent system, to try to block generics for years. That's really the type of incentives that the IRA is focused on changing. And from our perspective, that's great. We would love to see those resources invested in breaking new ground, in meaningful new clinical breakthroughs, rather than endless gaming and blocking of generic competition for top-selling drugs on the market.
Right, and for those drugs that are negotiated, when that price eventually comes down, I think there have been some questions from industry as well as to whether patients will actually see lower prices at the pharmacy counter. So I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that as well.
Yeah, Medicare will be at the negotiating table, negotiating the best deal for American seniors and for taxpayers, and that's going to be a critical benefit. It will lower prices across the board, and so all Medicare beneficiaries can expect to see those benefits and premiums. And we also expect that it will lower prices for individual patients taking those drugs, and we look forward to continuing to deliver on the program.
And from the White House, we know that the Medicare negotiation program is pretty popular in polling among the American public when they're asked about it. But I think there's also been some polling showing that there's gaps in awareness, that people just knowing that the program even existed, that the law is in the process. It's hard when it's not quite, to the finish line yet. We aren't going to see these new prices until 2026. So I'm curious as to how you're thinking about making sure that voters, that the American public is aware of this program.
Absolutely. We've been talking about the negotiation program, which is only one piece of the IRA, and I want to come back to that in a second. But there are many critical components of the IRA that are either already online, delivering benefits to people since the beginning of 2023, or that are coming online on January 1st, 2024. So for the last year, 1.5 million Medicare beneficiaries have been saving on insulin, thanks to $35 insulin under the Inflation Reduction Act. Millions of folks have access to free vaccines because of the Inflation Reduction Act, a critical benefit that's saving folks an average of about $70 per year on vaccine copays. And starting on January 1st, all Medicare beneficiaries will, for the first time, have their out-of-pocket cost capped in the Part D program. So seniors across the country are right now shopping for Medicare plans for their Part D coverage for next year that includes that critical protection, that meaningful financial protection from high drug costs for the first time ever. And so we are really excited to be delivering that for folks, and we're going to keep talking about those benefits. And we're also going to be in conversation with people about the work we are doing to negotiate prescription drug prices and the efforts by congressional Republicans to roll back this power. We have seen bills in both chambers that are attempting to take away these critical benefits, to repeal Medicare's ability to negotiate drug prices, which 80% of the American people support. And we think it's critical that we highlight those differences.
Absolutely. So, the IRA was obviously passed by Congress, but the executive branch, there are things on drug pricing that you all can do as well. And Senator Bernie Sanders earlier this year essentially held confirmation of the NIH director hostage to try to get more concessions out of the White House, to take a more aggressive stance on something called March-in rights, or breaking a patent if a drug's price is too high, which has never been done before. But I think I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about kind of where the White House's position is right now on using March-in rights in relation to price.
Yeah, absolutely. Senator Sanders and the president see eye to eye on the importance of lowering prescription drug costs for the American people, and the critical importance that this issue has for so many families. When it comes to the issue of March-in specifically, earlier this year, the Department of Health and Human Services, together with the Department of Commerce, launched a formal process to develop real formal criteria for the first time for the use of margin rights when it comes to evaluating how patent holders are using technology that was created with federal dollars. And for the first time, as part of that process, the federal government made clear that it would be looking at price and trying to identify criteria for use of margin in a way that was inclusive of the price of the product. And that work is ongoing inside the federal agencies, and something that they're taking a close look at to really be able to say something more concrete about this authority and how it might someday be used.
Right, and do we have a sense of the timeline on that? Because, I mean, time is ticking.
I don't have anything to preview at this point, but the agencies are hard at work.
Okay, and also just wanted to open up a conversation about the FTC. You know, they've also been very involved in this space, and I'm curious what's most exciting to you or interesting to you about kind of where they're going.
Absolutely. I think we have seen really tremendous partnerships between the FTC and the FDA in the last couple of years around how FTC can use its authorities to go after some of the patent gaming that violates U.S. law or is otherwise anti-competitive. The FTC is obviously an independent agency, and we at the White House aren't engaged in their enforcement decisions or any of their other work. But they have opened up some data sharing with FDA that they've announced that's really exciting, and they've also issued a joint policy statement with FDA about certain anti-competitive actions that FTC is going to be taking a close look at, and it's really part of a comprehensive view across the federal government of what we can do to lower Americans' drug prices.
Right, so drug prices are one part of your very large portfolio, but obviously there are many others as well. And one issue I wanted to make sure to touch on is coverage. And in 2022, we saw historic low uninsured rates. I mean, a big win for the administration. But as this year has gone on, we've seen Medicaid redeterminations in the states as COVID-era protections for Medicaid enrollees have started to roll back. Funding has started to roll back for states, and the latest numbers I've seen, it's more than 11 million people have been kicked off of their Medicaid coverage since that whole process started. And there have been state-level advocates who want the Biden administration to do more. You know, they're saying that they want name and shaming, they want more aggressive enforcement actions. I think there's just a lot of frustration and panic that's bubbling up as people are going to the emergency room and finding out that they don't actually have health insurance that they thought they had for a procedural reason. So I'm curious for you, when do you stop playing nice with states? Why take that approach in the first place? Can you just explain how you're approaching this very difficult issue?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And you know, to back up a little bit, I mean, fundamentally, the Biden administration believes that healthcare is a right and not a privilege, and that has animated so much of our work. We are incredibly proud of the 4 states that have expanded Medicaid under this administration, including North Carolina, where 600,000 people are going to gain Medicaid coverage starting on Friday. We've lowered premiums in ACA coverage by $800 per person per year, and driven enrollment in the ACA to record highs and uninsurance to record lows in ways that have persisted throughout 2023 so far. But we have also seen that our safety net is too hard for people to access, and there are administrative barriers that get in the way of people accessing coverage to which they are entitled. And so we are doing everything in our power across all of our programs to take on those administrative barriers. We've made a number of changes in the way the Affordable Care Act enrollment process works that have helped contribute to reducing barriers and that record high enrollment. CMS recently announced that while in most years you see a sort of slow decline throughout the course of the year in ACA coverage, during 2023, there are 1.5 million more people enrolled in ACA coverage compared to the sort of downward trajectory that you saw in 2022 because of our work to make it easier for folks to enroll and to lessen some of those administrative barriers. But you absolutely see that in the Medicaid program as well. States did not conduct Medicaid renewals for 3 years. As a result, the Medicaid program enrollment swelled, and states are now undergoing a renewal process, and that is putting too much burden on families as they go through the Medicaid process. As a result, The Biden administration has offered an unprecedented array of flexibilities to states to change things about their Medicaid renewal process and make it easier for them to keep folks enrolled in coverage. We've made it easier to auto-enroll more people. We've given folks more time to fill out their forms, and taken a wide variety of steps to smooth the enrollment process and try to break down as many of those administrative barriers as possible. But it is absolutely true that states need to step up. When we have caught states breaking the rules, we have stepped in and immediately required them to make pretty big changes to fix those problems. So earlier this year, about 30 states were discovered to have a problem in their enrollment systems where they were not auto-enrolling people who should have been automatically renewed. As soon as CMS caught the problem, it demanded that all those states pause their process, reinstate everybody that had been wrongly disenrolled from the program, and fix their systems going forward. And those are long-term changes that are going to benefit the Medicaid program over the long term. There are states that are doing this well, that are taking advantage of the full range of flexibilities to maximize enrollment and coverage. And there are states that are doing this poorly. They are charging families enrollment fees when their kids move from Medicaid to CHIP. They're sending pages and pages of renewal forms instead of automatically enrolling people when they're enrolled in SNAP or they have incomes below poverty or otherwise have circumstances that would qualify them for auto-enrollment. And states need to step up and they need to do more to take advantage of those flexibilities and make the process as easy as possible for the families they serve.
Okay, so as you look to 2024, I mean, we could be sitting here a year from now and things could look very different. And so you have, a year left in this administration, and I want to hear, like, kind of what do you view as the 3 things you'd really like to make sure get accomplished before the end of President Biden's first term?
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about 2 of them. Fundamentally, we want to maximize the number of people that have health insurance and make our health insurance system work as well as possible for as many people as possible. We want to lower healthcare costs. It's a critical issue. Lowering prescription drug prices is a big piece of that. And so we are committed to delivering on the benefits of the IRA, to lowering people's costs throughout 2024 and making prescription drugs more affordable. But we are also concerned about healthcare costs across the spectrum. CBO recently published a report that there are about $4 trillion in healthcare spending that didn't happen from 2011 to the present, at the same time that we put in place a lot of reforms to the way Medicare pays for care to emphasize value and make other structural changes in Medicare payment. And we want to continue to build on that progress, lower costs for people, and build a healthcare system that is affordable and accessible to everyone. The third theme I would highlight is around mental health, which we haven't talked about. But basically any statistic on mental health right now is deeply alarming. We see kids and adults across the country struggling with the burden of serious mental illness or with anxiety and depression or with substance use disorder at really alarming rates. And so the Biden administration has announced a 3-part strategy to try to take on the mental health crisis in the country and address these issues head on. And we're focused on care, coverage, and causes. We need more mental health providers, and we need to use every lever we have as the federal government to build more facilities, bring more people into these professions, and develop innovative ways of delivering care and reaching people. We need better coverage for mental health. We proposed a landmark set of improvements to the mental health parity rule to try to make sure that Americans have better access to mental health care in their insurance plans, and a series of reforms to Medicare to try to improve Medicare coverage. And we're going to continue to build on those efforts to improve insurance coverage for mental health so that people can get the services they need. And finally, causes. There's a lot we don't know about the mental health crisis, but there are themes that are emerging, and so we are focused on promoting wellness and resiliency in all environments. We need to hold social media companies accountable for the national experiment they are conducting on our kids for profit. We need to make it easier for schools to promote wellness and resiliency in their classrooms and in their school nurses' offices and throughout their programming, and we need to build a safety net that supports mental resilience and wellness and meets people where they are and helps deliver those services. And so that's another critical priority for us.
Sounds like you have your work cut out for you. I
We
think
keep busy.
We have time for one audience question over here, and we'll keep that brief, please.
Good evening. I'm Frank Purcell with Indivior, and we're predominantly interested in addiction treatment and addressing this opioid crisis. And as I know, the administration has prioritized that in several respects. In the Medicaid unwinding process, you'd mentioned we really have two populations here. One population of folks that have undergone this unwinding process, reducing the enrollment Medicaid by some 11 million people. And then there's everyone in the future that is yet to undergo this revalidation process. It sounds like a lot of the administration's mitigations for the challenge here have focused on those future populations. But for those who have already lost Medicaid, is the administration at work with states to support technical assistance or education or other initiatives to support people re-enrolling into Medicaid or enrolling into Affordable Care Act plans? Dealing with this is so critical because if people with OUD, opioid use disorder, lose coverage, you know, they end up being a challenge just themselves, their families, their loved ones. Much worse things can happen to them if they don't have coverage that frankly also costs the taxpayers a ton. I'd like to know what the administration's up to with that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as you certainly know, one of the core features of the Medicaid program is that people who are eligible for Medicaid but not enrolled can enroll in the program at any time. And when they do enroll, Medicaid will cover their healthcare expenditures looking backwards for a period of 90 days. And so that means that people who remain eligible for Medicaid but don't currently have an insurance card from the program have the ability to get back into coverage and have their healthcare claims paid. And so we are working with states, and we know states are working with providers to smooth that re-enrollment process. We are keeping a close eye on wait times at states and ensuring that they are processing paperwork quickly and getting people that have come out of Medicaid back into the process as quickly as possible and with as few gaps as possible. And we are also absolutely committed to supporting people enrolling in Affordable Care Act coverage. As I mentioned, we saw enrollment growth of 1.5 million people from March to September of 2023 in the Affordable Care Act as that program for the first time ever grew during the course of the year to serve more people. We've already seen about 1 million new consumers come in to Affordable Care Act coverage in just the first 2 weeks of open enrollment this year. So we know this program is there for people, and it is meeting with them where they are and getting them enrolled in coverage. But we are going to be laser focused on, again, streamlining the process for providers, helping people get reconnected to Medicaid where that's appropriate, and leaving the front door of the ACA wide open for folks to come in and get connected to coverage through the Affordable Care Act.
All right, thank you so much. That's all we have time for this evening, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, so one of the things that we try to do at our events, almost every event, is make sure that we're including patient voices. In this case, it's going to come in the form of a video. So I would love for everyone to just watch this intro about how we're going to fix the drug shortage crisis. From Laura Bray, Chief Changemaker and founder of Angels for Change.
Good evening. My name's Laura Bray, Chief Changemaker at Angels for Change. Angels for Change is on a mission to end drug shortages through advocacy, awareness, and a resilient supply chain. I'd like to thank Stat News for hosting this evening and bringing awareness to the drug shortage crisis. When I founded Angels for Change 4 years ago, it was after my own child faced a life-saving drug shortage during her pediatric cancer journey. I was ill-prepared to answer her question, "Will I die, Mom, without my medicine?" It was such a cruel place to find ourselves as a family in crisis. The only answer I had for her was that we're going to try. We'll try and find it. Sometimes, in trying, extraordinary things happen. But how was it that a family found themselves in a predicament that their only choice was to miss life-saving chemotherapy or search like a needle in a haystack, the largest global supply chain in the world? How is it that our pharmaceutical supply chain is so brittle that it fails, and it fails patients on a daily basis? Why isn't there additional supply to make sure no child, no patient goes without their medicine? These were just a few of the questions I had as I founded Angels for Change. At our founding, we were the only nonprofit patient advocacy organization in the country with a mission to end drug shortages, who also takes calls directly from patients, physicians, pharmacists, and hospitals each day to connect them to medicine and make sure our essential medicines are in the right place at the right time. This is the supply chain that fills the hands that save our people. And right now, too often, their hands are empty and lives are being lost. Not just patient impact of my own 9-year-old roller coaster loving middle child, but a 5-year-old Spider-Man super fan, 14-year-old violinist, a grandpa with 5 grandchildren who are the loves of his life, a father of 2, of an Army veteran. Your friends, your family, your neighbors are being failed by a supply chain that is not redundant enough to ensure access when our patients need it every single day, every single time. Tonight, as you listen to the panelists share about the drug shortage crisis, I urge you to be thinking about, what can I do to end this crisis? How can we have the right actions and sense of urgency that our loved ones, our patients, our citizens, our neighbors deserve to ensure that no 9-year-old ever has to ask their mom, am I going to die without my medicine? Thank you.
Thank you. And to Laura for taking the time to share her story. And to continue this conversation, please welcome to the stage Jessica L. Daly, Group Vice President, Strategic Sourcing at Premier Inc., Salim Faruqi, Executive Vice President of the Pharmaceuticals Business Unit at Fresenius Kabi, Vimila Raghavendran, Vice President of Informatics Product Development at U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and Dr. Marta Iwosinska, Senior Fellow in the Center on Health Policy at the Brookings Institution, and to moderate, John Wilkerson, Washington correspondent at STAT, who's wearing amazing shoes.
Okay, I hope you guys have one more panel in you. Let's sit down. I think that...
Feel free to ask these guys questions.
Yes. Laura Bray's video was a great way to start this discussion because it shows you just how gut-wrenching drug shortages can be. And I think another takeaway is that this has been going on a very long time. It's been happening for decades. So we have 4 experts up here who in the next half hour or so are going to solve it for us. I'm going to do some brief introductions really quickly. Marta Wozinska, Dr. Marta Wozinska, she's a senior fellow at Brookings, and she has researched and written extensively about drug shortages and how to solve the problem. Vimla
Raghavendran.
Thank you. Boy, I practiced that for hours in the mirror, and I still messed it up. She's at USP, US Pharmacopoeia. They are unusually well placed to understand the drug shortage problem because they know who makes what where, and she heads the supply chain center. Next we have Salim Faruqi, who is the global production head for Fresenius Kabi. Fresenius Kabi is one of the largest producers of generic injectables, and that's important because those are the types of drugs that are usually in short supply. And then Jessica Daly, she works at Premier. There are 3 group purchasing organizations that buy about 90% of the drugs that hospitals use. And Jessica is the supply chain VP for Premier, which is one of those GPOs. So I think any of you can probably answer this question, but I'm going to start with Marta. What is causing drug shortages?
So first of all, what is a drug shortage? It's when demand exceeds supply. And the way you can have a drug shortage is that simply suddenly demand really spiked. So if you think about ventilator drugs during COVID, or for example, Ozempic more recently, that's a demand-driven shortage. Those have tended to affect branded products much more than generics. Generic drugs that go into shortages are frequently because there are supply disruptions. And primarily because of manufacturing quality problems, where a facility actually has to stop production. The current drug shortage crisis with cancer chemotherapy drugs. So Laura's daughter experienced an earlier wave of chemotherapy drugs. We're back again with chemotherapy drugs, but that one was also caused by a supply disruption. The market is sufficiently concentrated. There aren't as many producers that if one of them shuts down, in this case, the manufacturer that contributed to the shortage most recently had, for one of the products, 50% market share. It's very difficult for other manufacturers to ramp up production quickly enough. Not only that, all the hospitals panic. They try to stockpile the product. That makes it worse. And that's how we end up with shortages.
Gotcha. So hospitals, do you feel that hospitals are unappreciated part of this problem? Anybody can answer that.
I mean, I'll take that. So just by way of context, a little bit more of an introduction, if I may. At the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, we've been working on a project called the Medicine Supply Map, where, as you said, we've been mapping the supply chain, and we do work to predict drug shortages. So we spend a lot of time looking at the data, right? And you definitely, so yes, the answer to your question is yes. Ultimately, what we see as one of the biggest predictors of drug shortages is low price points. Just as an example, we did an analysis of, and hospitals ultimately are the payers of these drugs, so that's where I'm going. We did an analysis of cancer drugs in shortage recently, and the price point for those drugs in shortage was $2.30 for an injectable drug that needs to be sterile. It's a chemotherapy drug, which means it's a difficult API ingredient to synthesize, expensive ingredient to synthesize, and $2.30 is less than what I paid to get here on the metro. And then if you compare that to other essential cancer drugs, we did that comparison. These are again generic drugs, but the ones that are not in shortage, you see price points around $1,400. So for that basket that we looked at. So that is one of the biggest drivers, and ultimately hospitals are the buyers. So yes. Long-winded way of saying this.
So, and I fully agree with you, right? It's fundamentally, when people ask me what's wrong, why has it continued to go on for so long, it's a broken market, right? It's a fundamentally dysfunctional market. And especially after the last couple of sessions, it becomes really unintuitive to think about the fact that when someone talks about pharma, and they say, you're telling me that it's a economic problem for pharma to supply, but that's really what it is. And Marta, I agree with your points. There's certainly those supply disruptions on the quality side. I actually think those are more the symptomatics of the problem, right? So you're going to get this over-concentration that happens because many suppliers will choose or are not able to step into that market because of the economics concentrating supply, and then something happens. And yes, quality issues are one. It could be anything. It could be supply chain disruptions due to a global pandemic. It could be a tornado. There's a lot of reasons why, and the system isn't resilient enough because of this economic model that allows people to step in quickly. Right?
I do just want to add, as someone coming from the GPO, we represent providers. We represent the hospitals and the providers around the country that, as Laura said earlier, are delivering that care to your family members, to your friends, to the patients that are in need. I think it's oversimplifying the problem to say that it's the provider's fault that the prices are low. Providers are operating even more now on razor-thin margins. One of the largest components of every healthcare provider's budget is the drug spend. There are very few places within a drug spend that they can optimize their margin, they can optimize the spend that they make in the market. And unfortunately, because of the way our system has been designed, I agree with you completely, it is an absolutely broken economic model, but we are incentivizing providers to cut the cost where they can, unfortunately, is in multi-source generics. Right. You're not able to negotiate pricing and save money and cut cost in some of the higher cost branded items. And quite frankly, our economic model is incentivized to increase the price of brand products, to pay more. So your insurers, CMS, private insurers, others are paying more for high cost branded items and are incentivized to do that. Whereas on the generic side, the payment structure, what your providers are making, what they're able to recuperate to cover the cost of the labor, the doctors, the nurses, the facilities, the drug itself, is all coming out of one bucket. So it's an absolutely broken system. So I just want to be very careful, though, that we are not blaming the providers for bringing costs down. It absolutely goes back to how those providers are paid and incentivized to use generic drugs.
Gotcha. So then how do we incentivize hospitals to do the right thing?
You want to go?
So a colleague of mine and I put out a proposal earlier this summer about how, and we're specifically focusing on hospitals because that's where most of the drug shortages happen, and it's around sterile injectable shortages. What we're proposing is to involve CMS and have CMS help change the calculus that hospitals have, not through add-on payments, because these are, Part A drugs largely, and there's a DRG, and the bottom line is that what we need to do is pay more for reliability and not just pay on price. And so basically we would need to have signals of reliability to be able to do an add-on payment. What we have proposed is CMS could change the weight of it by setting up actually a pay-for-performance program where hospitals are rated on how well they're doing before there's a signal of shortage. Who are you buying from? Are you doing your homework to figure out who might be likely or not to have a shortage? And then where you're buying from them that you have long-term contracts. Now, we don't expect that hospitals would be doing this homework. We're hoping that the GPOs will do this homework, and frankly, they're already doing this homework. Every GPO is actually looking and asking manufacturers, give me your inspection reports from FDA, tell us all of this information. But then at the end of the day, because again of the incentives that hospitals have, let's say that Jessica puts, I don't know, I will use the cancer shortage here. I'll use the cancer shortage here. Fresenius is actually in the market in which Intas was in, the manufacturer that actually ended up having all of these manufacturing quality problems. So were you choosing Fresenius Kabi or were you choosing Intas? Number one, the question to the GPO. But right now, the GPO, if they put Intas and Intas is much cheaper, hospitals will buy off contract. Hospitals don't have to buy what the GPO contracted. So it doesn't matter how much homework they would do. It's ultimately, the hospital will buy off contract. What we're proposing is to actually nudge both the GPO to do a really good job, kind of thinking about doing their homework and who is more reliable. And number two, then rewarding the hospitals that actually do end up buying potentially a higher price point, potentially a committed volume. So you might have heard about the Civica model. Some hospitals are trying to do, in a sense, something like that. They're vetting, Civica is vetting the manufacturers, then they themselves want to become the manufacturer with high quality products. And then they also have long-term contracts that they set up. But it's that concept of valuing reliability more in the process and not just buying on price specifically.
And the elements that are really interesting about that is that shared accountability model, right? Because, I mean, we fully understand the pressures that the hospitals and the healthcare system is, but as opposed to always the accountability is on the manufacturer, the GPO, the hospital. With a method like that, you can share that and spread that accountability out for reliable supply, right? Because at that point, you start to at least give visibility and weight to procurement decisions beyond just price. I think it already happens, but at some point it needs to become a little more sophisticated.
Well, I think there's thousands and thousands of generic drugs on the market, and so a lot of what the work is that goes into this is evaluating where your areas of greatest risk are. So as the GPO, right, we're employing AI and machine learning to identify and predict in advance when there is likely to be a shortage. We are tracking that. We're working with our suppliers to plug those gaps and fill those holes. To Marta's point, we've seen incredible success with high commitment programs. So we do quite a few actually with Fresenius Kabi, where we work directly with the supplier to build long-term stable pricing agreements that the providers then commit purchasing volume. It gives all of us in the supply chain not only more stable pricing and more stable access, it's better visibility to long-term manufacturing capacity, which is so critical for how you build out your capacity.
Absolutely right. Because, and maybe one way to really drive that point home, which a lot of people don't understand, right, is how can we have market shortages for critical cancer drugs and at the same time have about 50% underutilization in our plants in the US? I mean, that's a fact that just doesn't jive, right? There's something fundamentally wrong, and that's that predictability element of it, the ability to plan around it and to be able to run an efficient operation when you know that you've got that volume.
And so then would a value-based payment system for hospitals, do you think that this would do the job? And if so, are there what are some of the details that you would like to see worked out on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of nuance, right? So essentially what you're looking to try to do is have a hospital incentivized to factor in more than price. And what does that mean? Whether it's surge capacity, buffer capacity, a supplier willing to hold a certain number of months of inventory, a vendor management inventory program. These are the things that essentially will help. But ultimately it comes down to perhaps how they're reimbursed, right? So ultimately, I still think if you ask a hospital right now, they will clearly say, most of them will say, absolutely, we value reliability and all the things you just mentioned. But in the end, when you look at their behavior, they're going to gravitate towards that price because of the pressures they're under, right? So one of the elements that potentially would be looked at is, how are they reimbursed on the cost that comes through and how is that valued? And I think, Marta, maybe that was a little bit of where you were going, right?
Can I add? So you asked, do we think that is enough? I don't think it's enough. I think when you look at drug shortages, Marta did a really nice job of explaining many of the factors that lead to drug shortages. It's a very multifactorial issue, right? There's a lot of different things that can create a drug shortage. So I don't think that there is one simple answer. Paying for providers to utilize and purchase higher cost generics will certainly help. It will certainly help to stop some of those swings where we see that price shopping in the market. But I think there's a lot more to it, and we can talk about quality, right? We could talk about how you look at quality manufacturers. We could talk about some of the things that the FDA might be able to do to help, right? We've got some provisions as part of the CARES Act that haven't been fully implemented that look at standardizing how the FDA looks at suppliers around the globe. So where you have a US-based supplier that is very used to surprise annual inspections, that's not the same everywhere around the world. And much of our drug supply chain comes from outside of the US. How do we ensure the same level of scrutiny and quality here as we do outside of the US, I think is also another important factor that we need to consider.
I mean, I'll also add that we need an early warning system for drug shortages. Much like we have for the weather. We have been in the business of predicting drug shortages for a while now, so I can tell you that the signals exist, they abound. And it should have been a surprise to no one that there was weakness in the cancer market. I mean, like as Marta said, this was sort of the second go around in recent history. And so, it's really criminal that we sort of react to drug shortages when they eventually impact patients, and we really need to move to a more proactive model.
So two things, if I may. So number one, I completely agree. The way I see the proposal that we put forward, that it's more of a necessary but not a sufficient solution or factor to take on. If we don't change how hospitals buy, we're not going to get very far. But is this going to be enough? No, because there are a lot of other reasons why shortages happen. I mean, we need to be thinking about geopolitical risks and other factors. There's this can only go so far. It's particularly well suited for assessing, for example, quality, right, and sort of driving the market to do a better job around there. But less so with other factors. But again, I feel that that's sort of the core piece, because changing how hospitals buy is really key. And then there's a lot of other things we should be doing. I do need to comment on the early warning system. So it depends who you're going to be warning. I really worry about early warning systems that are being developed right now, where a hospital is trying to get an early warning system, and basically as a signal to start buying. There's a lot of panic buying going on. What I really worry about is those kinds of early warning signals, just like go out and buy and have a bank run. What I think is really important is for the federal agencies, for example, for wholesalers, for manufacturers, to have that so that they can prepare so that we don't end up with the panic buying. So just sort of a caveat on.
Yeah, so no, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we have something like 6,000 hospitals in the US. And, Laura, who spoke earlier, spends a lot of her time calling Hospital A to see if they have any product that they can give to Hospital B. And even if you look at the recent cancer drug shortages, except for a few weeks here and there actually was enough supply in the market. It just was not where the patients were. I mean, some hospitals had too much and other hospitals had too little. So this is a real problem. And so I completely agree with you that an early warning system should target the relevant decision maker that can use that information to make proactive investments in the supply chain. So for example, with the medicine supply map, manufacturers use it to identify where the market opportunities might be, where they can sort of where they need to increase production. And then manufacturers and distributors use it to figure out where to invest in supply chain resilience. And we can talk about what that looks like.
And one of the things on that's really top of mind for us is the redundancy element of it, right? And especially that came up in the video as well, and that hit really close to home because, not sure how close everyone is to sterile injectable manufacturing, right? Even with that warning, that early warning sign, when do we go from getting the warning to actually getting product to patient, right? And in many cases, because of the market dynamic and who's in the game and who's choosing to be in the game, that can take a lot longer than most people think. And this is where surge capacity, buffer API, a lot of these things, perhaps even API stored within the US, are things that we can really do proactively to prepare for whatever the event's going to be. And none of us can predict what it is. What we can say is it's going to happen. There will be something, and it's just our ability to react to it.
Excuse me, we have a question in the audience. I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a general internist. I'm also an attorney. My first job out of law school was at the FDA. I also worked for a law firm that sued PBMs and others for kickbacks and all sorts of complicated financial chicanery in the supply line. I have a question. The question is for you, Dr. Farooq. What is underutilization? Is that people who don't take up vaccines?
No, I'm sorry.
And the second comment is, yes, it's true, that you're paying $250 for something that is worth a lot more. But on the other hand, there's the $25 Tylenol. You're charging, you're paying $250 and you're charging a whole lot more. So that cost saving is not passed along to the patients.
So maybe I'll start first. So when I mean underutilization, it's excess capacity. So for a sterile injectable generics plant, for it to run efficiently and actually be able to make money, right? It typically has to run at 90 to 95% utilization, right? And that does a couple of things, right? When that happens, if there's an event from somebody else in the market, not even caused by the manufacturer themselves, and there's an in huge order we can't supply. So that becomes a certain issue. And then there's other areas, and this is the part that's the heartbreaking bit, is where because of that market dynamic, there is a shortage, we have the capability, we have a line that's only 50% utilized, right? And that's
what happens to the rest of it? Or why don't you know what the demand is? If you have a sense of what the,
Why don't you know what the demand is? If you have a sense
yeah.
of, say, diabetes, you have a general idea of how many people have, I mean, I know that's not an injectable, but a certain kind of cancer, you know what the incidence is, you know what.
The principle, simply put, is that that award for that business went someplace else. And almost always it went someplace else because of price.
The margins are really low. A manufacturer actually goes back to the warning system. If you will tell Fresenius Kabi, we're worried that Intas is going to have a problem, they're going to say, okay, we don't have a contract, nobody's buying from us. We're not gonna, make so many batches of this product because we don't know that they're gonna have a problem for sure. And then what we're gonna do, we're gonna sit on this product. And so it just doesn't, again, sort of the economics doesn't work. There's really no reason for them to ramp up. And this actually happened during COVID as well. Initially, early in COVID, manufacturers, were being told of tests to ramp up production. They would ramp up production and then nobody wanted to buy it. Actually, I've heard from manufacturers, they were getting multi-million-dollar returns of ventilator drugs recently because hospitals can return them as long as they are still not expired, which is 2 years later. And so if you're a manufacturer, why would you be making production just in case when nobody's paying for it?
Well, and the other side of it is you don't know how long the shortage is going to last
that's right.
either. So
That's
you
right.
could go through all of the changes that you need to make, whether it's tech transfer, which would take forever, or you could retool the line.
I love it when people talk about tech transfer.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You could retool the lines, right? You could switch production over.
Yeah.
And you might just get started, and then the shortage has resolved, and you've spent all of that time and money.
Yeah.
It's very hard to
And I brought up
predict.
that point because it is that disconnect, right? It's unintuitive. How can we have shortages for critical products and at the same time have lines that aren't running?
Right. So
Right?
it's
That doesn't really. I mean, that describes the problem in a nutshell.
right. So part of the solution is to pay hospitals to pay you enough that you can maintain buffer stock, and that would be part of the contract. And if they do that type of thing, then they would be paid more by Medicare instead of someone who doesn't, and they don't get a good value-based payment. I want to real quick switch gears here and ask about what the president announced yesterday, and it fits into a lot of what you guys are talking about now because it's domestic production. Biden said he has a plan for boosting domestic production that gets made in the USA, gets talked a lot about. How important is domestic production to fixing the drug shortage problem? Because drugs are made all over the world.
I mean, I'll just say really quickly that in the data, we see that geographic diversity is actually a good predictor of a resilient supply chain, but that doesn't mean it has to be made in the US. And in fact, just in the last year, we've had a tornado hit one plant, another plant shut down for bankruptcy, a third plant decided to discontinue production. All of this happened in the US. So, I don't think the US is a guarantee, US-based production is a guarantee of a resilient supply chain necessarily, but a diversified supply chain is.
I think that's so important. The diversity in the supply chain is critically important. I think it is unique also. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we see a lot of rigor with US-based drugs that are manufactured and the level of inspection that they receive. So there's a very nice kind of a comfort and quality element to having US produced products. I think what's really important as we think about some of the announcements that came out today, if we're going to put more investment into bringing drug shortage products, supply chain manufacturing back here into the United States, we need to have the teeth that wherever that money goes, whoever has accepted that money actually has to produce drug shortage products in a reasonable amount of time that is going to get to a patient and create a solution.
Right. I mean, my view on this being very close to it, obviously, I think clearly a diverse supply chain is always better. The attributes of what makes a reliable supplier can absolutely be done from non-US based suppliers as well. The US supply, the advantage there is more of in a socio-political event that would potentially happen, where you'd have domestic control. That's probably it. And then also, some level of rapid conversion. So how quickly would you be able to take a shortage product and act on it? When the US, the shipping time would be oftentimes a couple of months sometimes, right? So.
Got it. And there is also, however, some problem with U.S. regulators not being able to inspect facilities. And it's not just abroad, but in countries like India and China, correct? And it seems like Marta said that one of the big problems is quality, and that seems to fit right in with making it domestically. I realize you're never going to make all of the drugs here, but do you guys have a sense of how much more U.S. production there should be?
So first of all, domestic does not mean quality. It's just so important to understand, because otherwise we could just have an add-on payment for anything that's domestic. If you look historically at drug shortages, they have been primarily caused by manufacturing quality problems in US-based facilities. So it's just really important that we get away, and frankly, sort of in strings attached, that they make shortage products and that they meet certain quality standards. If you're going to be giving a manufacturer money to build facilities here, it's important to do that. It's not how much we have. So one of the concerns that I have about the onshoring discussion is that it can very easily become a feel-good strategy. That we're bringing manufacturing back home, but the number of drugs that are out there, there's 20,000 FDA-approved drug products. They're made in just between finished dosage form and API, and I'm not talking about key starting materials and excipients and so on. There's probably 17,000 facilities, of which the majority are outside of the U.S. We can't bring this back. And then you think about key starting materials and so on. So we have to be, if we want to actually make a dent in the geopolitical sort of thinking about geopolitics, we need to be very strategic about what we onshore. And that we don't, for example, onshore an API manufacturer for a product where all of the upstream still comes from China. Like, we wouldn't solve that problem, right? So the concern I have is that it's going to be like, who wants to build a facility in the US? And we will be a really expensive feel-good strategy, because we're not gonna solve the problem. It has to be very strategic. And so back to what you said, what was encouraging to me in the announcement that came out yesterday is an indication that there is this strategic approach. For example, this announcement of a coordinator and thinking about, so the first part of it was around using the Defense Production Act and expanding Title III within sort of ASPR, which is very much focused on pandemics and medical countermeasures. What I appreciated also about the announcement is that they seem to kind of be broadening the scope, to be thinking about supply chains more broadly than just sort of the ASPR piece, and that this coordinator was going to, and a little bit more sort of, anyway, it was, I think it's sort of, it seemed like there was this sort of strategic direction and thinking more broadly about supply chains and where to intervene.
Yeah. We have a question.
I just wanted to, I have to comment, right? And I absolutely agree with you on the onshoring idea, right? Because it sounds great, but without some of these other fixes to the market, let's predict what's going to happen in the future. So the government or some entity gives money to build new manufacturing sites. They come online 7 years later, and then at the same time, they have the same exact problem in that they're trying to manufacture products that are below their cost of goods. So I think I understand why folks gravitate to that, because it sounds like a solution. I just want to reiterate your point that we should be really careful and thoughtful about that. And then again, back to the APIs, you couldn't possibly bring all of that onshore.
John, do you want to go to an audience question? We have one
Sure.
here. Great.
Sure.
Can you say your name?
Yeah, hi, I'm Maisha from Inside Washington Publishers. So recently I came up with a Manhattan Institute report that says FDA does not use a statistical approach to interpret shortages and does not clearly mention whether it counts the drugs that have been on shortage for a longer period or a shorter period. nor does it report on excess demand of drugs observed during shortages. So my question is, do you think Congress should try to find ways to monitor FDA's efforts to identify and stem shortages as this report recommends?
I'm not sure that will be my top congressional request around FDA. It is true that the data that's available on the FDA website does not necessarily provide as much information as people would like. The piece actually I would like to see is who actually what was the company that was trigger of the shortage. That's frequently not disclosed, and they don't provide historical data on shortages and so on. But probably that would not be my top ask of FDA. I would probably be asking, number one, for a lot of more resources to do inspections, sort of ramping up, changing how they do inspections outside of the United States, having them focus more on developing the quality maturity program at the FDA to try to get some statistics, trying to standardize their inspections so there's sort of less noise in the information that comes out. So those probably would be the things that I would put higher up on the list.
And are there any other FDA authorities that you guys think they should have? Vimla, when I was introducing you, I said that USP knows who makes what where, but I don't think they know how much. Is that something that FDA should know?
I'm not the expert on this. I do think that there was a CARES, so don't quote me on this, but I think the CARES Act actually gave them the authority to collect that information. I don't know.
And they're working on it.
Yeah, but that was the. I think it's hard to say, I wish the FDA did more until we see how things actually fare when they implement the powers that they have.
And I will say, everyone sort of points to the FDA because they've got the word drug in their name. But, the FDA is probably the first to say, this is not a problem that the FDA is naturally well suited to solve. And I think that's why I was quite pleased to see the naming, so this announcement that came out where there were 30 actions, I think, around the supply chain and the coordinator role within HHS, which I think is great because, there's so many pieces to this. Marta, you've written a lot about the CMS's role. ASPR clearly has a role. And the Department of Commerce now has a role as well. And so a coordinator that can make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, I think would be great.
And to be fair, right, the FDA does do a lot as far as managing drug shortage. They work with us and other manufacturers on a routine and regular basis, trying to alleviate them, give a heads up, and manage that as best they can within their powers. One thing that's, I guess, obvious is, they are short-staffed. And that manifests itself anything from number of inspections abroad to even their ability to react perhaps faster on regulatory discretion, on changes that we need to make to react to a potential shortage, right? So.
Gotcha, yeah. So the FDA needs more money? Is that what you're saying? All right. I think people have been saying that for a while. Okay. Well, guys, did we solve it? We have 15 seconds left. We're good? All right. All right, people. Well, I think that is about it for us up here. Thank you very much, guys, for offering your expertise today.
So, you're all, I'm saying, oh no, he's going to make remarks. I'm really not. Thank you again to our sponsor, SureScripts, and thank you to all of you. You're heroes for sitting here through all of this. Great, but I know it's late, and we do have for another 45 minutes plus a whole bunch of food and drinks. So if people want to head out, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. It's great seeing all of you, and thank you for the questions, and we hope you had a great time.